the New Zealand Tech Podcast, brought to you by Gorilla Technology, proactive and strategic IT.
Hey folks, greetings and welcome along to the New Zealand Tech Podcast. I'm your host, Paul Spain. With me today is Todd Selwyn, who's Head of Networks at Samsung New Zealand. Welcome along, Todd.
Thanks, Paul. Good to be here.
Yeah, great to catch up again. Now, maybe you can remind listeners where you fit into this big wide world of technology and telecommunications in New Zealand.
Sure. I'm heading up the Samsung 5G program here in New Zealand. We're currently building a 5G network with Spark and bringing the great new technology to all the people and kind folks of Auckland.
Brilliant. Well, definitely looking forward to hearing a little bit more about that network side. But before we do, let's get into the tech news and the happenings of the week. And also a big thank you to our show partners for their support. So big thank you to Vodafone, 2 Degrees, Spark, HP, Gorilla Technology, and Deal. Righty ho. So first up, digital driver licenses. It's been a little bit of media coverage around this. It's been discussed a little bit in the past, and I guess it's not just driver our driving licenses. It's everything's sort of gone digital to a degree. In one part of the world or another. We even see in I think it's the US where you can have your digital passport, so you can cross the border without actually a physical passport. But now that's being considered for New Zealand from a driver licensing perspective. Seems from some perspectives good idea, because you don't have another thing to lose, and I guess in some ways the more that you can do from your smartphone, the better, until you lose it.
Exactly right.
It's wiped or what have you. I don't know. Do you think it's too soon, or we ready to start investigating this?
I'm a big supporter of it. I have been for a long time, especially with digital wallets and the like. But you also have to remember that not everybody has a smartphone and not everybody can afford a smartphone. So it creates a bit of a divide in society in terms of access when you're using technology to deliver that. But I think it's fantastic. I mean, I pay for everything with my smartphone, and we should have a driver's license on a smartphone. It'll take away that fine, for not having your license when the police pull you over. But again, we have to balance that out with not everybody has access to these technologies. So how do you make sure it's fair for everyone?
Yeah, it's a great point, and I guess there's that potentially opens a sort of can of worms on that broader sort of access to technology discussion, and probably got a few other things to delve into today, but it is something that we need to keep investigating, looking at, and nudging forward on an appropriate way, don't we? Because,
and then practically, you think you're pulled over by the police. Oh, my smartphone's flat. And what happens then? Yeah. Charge it up in the cop car. So there's some practical challenges.
Yeah.
Same with passports. They've always said, if you go to passports a third world country where they don't have a digital passport scanning platform, you can still use your paper passport today, but same problem really.
Yeah. Now, Wi-Fi 6, we've sort of got used to Wi-Fi 6 being the thing over the last little while, but Wi-Fi 7 is on its way now, and I guess we do get used to things just on this continual improvement when it comes to technology, and you're working with mobile networks and 5G. We know that sort of 6G on the mobile network front is kind of sitting there still, fortunately a few years out, so that we can get 5G in place and take advantage of it for hopefully best part of a decade before that needs to be somewhat superseded with the next generation. But Wi-Fi, as we head to Wi-Fi 7, the piece that I picked up on is that Intel and Broadcom, two really key players as far as making making the wireless chips is concerned, have demonstrated interoperability of their Wi-Fi 7 kit. And of course, there's usually a bit of a journey from designing what that next generation will be like before it goes through a certification process. But certainly encouraging to see that we've got this interoperability piece going. But in order to really take advantage of Wi-Fi 7, we need some extra spectrum available. In fact, it's the same with Wi-Fi 6E, which is what would you call 6E? It's sort of the extension to the base sort of Wi-Fi 6.
4G plus used to be.
That uses the 6 gigahertz spectrum to be able to get some significant benefits from a speed perspective. So it was interesting reading about Wi-Fi 7. What I noticed was that it's just been in the last few weeks actually that extra spectrum has been opened up in New Zealand. The six some of the 6 gigahertz spectrum, predominantly for indoor use. So bigger and better and faster Wi-Fi.
Yeah, it's an interesting space because you think about how fast these technologies moved, and you mentioned it before. Very hard from a regulatory perspective to keep up with that. Even digital microphones are now sitting in the middle of the 600 megahertz band where everybody wants to use that for 5G. So very hard to manage that from a regulatory perspective. Now we're also integrating iwi aspects into spectrum, and the technology is moving so fast that sometimes the regulation can be a bit slow to follow, I think. So it's good to see them being proactive in that space.
Yeah, look, I think it's a reasonable speed we're moving at in New Zealand. I guess comparatively it does vary a lot when you look around the world in terms of where that spectrum's been made available.
I mean, from a wholly selfish viewpoint, we'd like it to be faster and free up a lot more spectrums for the mobile network space. But you're competing obviously with different resources and different priorities of different people. So that's a challenge.
Yeah, and it's been interesting to see the likes of Starlink come into the market, and it seemed like a reasonably easy entry for satellite players to be able to operate, and without too much of a hassle in terms of getting access to spectrum, which I haven't really delved into the ins and outs of that, but
you're right. And
it
you
does seem very, very different to what our mobile networks have to go through, and the incredible level of investment to get access to spectrum there.
Yeah, you're right. You mentioned 6G, so already now we're seeing some of the industry start to standardize around what that spectrum might actually be because it uses so much bandwidth. That'd be great to get that sort of locked down and agreed the 10 years in advance so we can start to free those spectrums up when it does become available. You're sort of talking terabit speeds, so that would be impressive, but very bandwidth hungry. But yeah, if that can get agreed globally as a standard, then it's going to be a lot easier to implement.
Yeah, look, the situation whereby different countries have slice and dice up spectrum quite differently has some pretty major implications from complexity and cost perspective and so on. So
yeah, and back to your modem perspective, you want to have a standard modem platform generally because it's easier and more cost effective for building devices. So if every country is different, it will drive the cost up in those countries.
Yep. And I see there's been a little bit of sort of, I guess, push from the wireless internet service providers who, I guess, in one area are under pressure from sort of satellite broadband like Starlink, and then they want to be able to provide better offerings to their clientele, which tends to be those in rural locations where they maybe don't have any fiber access and not good access to fixed wireless, any sort of 4G 5G type connectivity in a lot of cases. But yeah, they're pushing and saying, hey, if we're going to take advantage of this sort of 6 gigahertz, we need a bigger chunk to make that that fly.
Right. And New Zealand's quite unique in that perspective, where you don't have national operators covering the whole country. And if you live somewhere, everybody knows someone who lives somewhere that has the worst internet ever and the worst connection, and they've had to spend all this money to have relays and microwave and all this sort of stuff. So there's definitely a place for it. Expensive, and if you also start thinking around that creative industries, and if we're trying to encourage technology, we really want those people to have same sort of access as everybody else. So I think it's a challenge we have as a nation to make sure we get the far reaches of the country covered off.
Yeah, yep, and I think we've done exceptionally well, but of course the needs are going to keep evolving and keep changing, right? And so, what was relevant a decade or so ago isn't necessarily going to be relevant for everyone, at least another 10, 20 years out.
Yeah, exactly.
So it will need to keep evolving. Interestingly, there does seem to be an ongoing level of confusion out there in the market. And before we started, you and I were chatting, and I mentioned a couple of people that have been in touch recently, telling me that they needed satellite internet connectivity. One of those cases, when I looked up the address, they actually had fiber available. Just said she just needed to place an order with a local, with their internet service provider. And so that was curious. And then another one, they didn't have fiber available, but some really good fixed wireless options available that would be a fraction of the price of getting a satellite connection, and without the signal having to go on a little 1,000 or 550 kilometer journey up and then back down again.
There's still the Netflix factor, people say, right? So you think how ubiquitous Netflix is and streaming, that's really driving that bandwidth use. I was looking at some stats. I think in the US, Netflix is responsible for 20% of the bandwidth consumption in the US. So it's still a huge driver. And even 5 years ago, half a dozen people had Netflix. Now everybody has Netflix. So it's it's such a given that utility. It's like water or power. You can't even have no internet, right?
Yeah, I cancelled my Netflix account this last week.
Have you?
Gone.
cut the cord.
I'm sure I'll be back, but hadn't been watching much on Netflix. So, and that's the thing now. We've got so many of these sort of services, but that video streaming, it's just an expectation that we all expect to be able to do, isn't it?
And the classic test is tell people to look up how much data they've used in a month at home, and people say, 40, 50 gigs, so they probably use 300.
Yeah.
Got no idea.
Yeah. Just, you don't have to think about it anymore, do you?
Exactly.
Now, I saw the BBC had picked up on a story here in New Zealand around, I think it was initially to do with Snapchat, and I guess it's sort of, virtual Moko or, Māori face tattoos. And that seemed to have, stirred up a bit of trouble online. First time I'd seen something like this happening, but I guess this is the world we're in, where it's sort of very easy at the drop of a hat for somebody to make a filter or some sort of add-on for one bit of software for another. And of course, that has been one of the hallmarks of the way Snapchat has operated, and we see that with some of these other platforms. So it certainly seems to have created a a bit of upset there with taking something that's very, very precious to Māori, and just making a kind of a mass replicable version.
Yeah, culturally insensitive, but it does raise that question around whose job is it to police that user generated content? Is it the platform, or is it the user, or is it the actual social media crowd? So I think in that instance, I'm sure the person would have taken it down once they got some pretty bad feedback, and so they come a little bit self-policing. But yeah, culturally insensitive.
Yeah, and I mean, it just highlights that we will have ongoing challenges with the ubiquitous access to technology, and people are going to try out different things, and sometimes they're going to do something that's seems fine to them, but once you look in a little bit further, there might be a little bit more or a lot more to it. So
Exactly.
yeah. Now on to, I guess, the big topics globally. Apple had their big announcements around their latest and greatest, we've seen Queen Elizabeth II pass away, a real end of an era. So maybe we'll delve into that one, into that aspect first. And I guess what caught my attention was that there seemed to be lots of bits and pieces sort of popping up around some of the firsts that the Queen was involved in from a technological standpoint. And initially, I'm scratching my head and thinking, "What, really? The Queen? Like, she was 96. What were these cutting edge things that she was involved in?" And when you sort of start looking into it, she was born in 1926, and so this last, you look back roughly 100 years. I mean, in her case is 96 years.
Yeah.
The technological change that's actually taken place in her lifetime. Now, my father's a little bit younger than the Queen, but born in the UK. And I remember talking to him about little town that he grew up in, a bit outside of London, and telling me that they didn't have power when he was growing up. And I
Crazy.
just struggled to get my head around that. But as I was reading some of these other things, it was the 1930s in the UK, where power started. The new homes were connected to an electricity grid. So yeah, this is going to be maybe the most sort of extreme period in history in terms of technological innovation, because we've gone from no power to power, and
Yeah.
a lot of people wouldn't have had phone lines and so on to where we are today. A few of the points, I guess that where she was on the cutting edge at age 14 in 1940. She gave the first public speech that was via radio, addressing children during World War II. 1953, then TV cameras were allowed into Westminster Abbey to cover the Queen's coronation. And apparently that helped sort of fuel a big demand for TV sets.
Oh,
The
really?
old
Wow.
early black and white CRT sets, I guess they would have been back in those days. And 500,000 TVs were sold in the weeks leading up to her coronation.
Amazing.
And there's a bunch more. We might mention some of the other sort of more modern ones, but I guess what it highlighted to me as I started looking at some of these things as the role that influential figures, that leaders like royalty and others that are in a position of influence, can have on society. So, as the Queen did, got involved in different, these different things where she, made use of technology. That actually helped spark the growth of technology, like we just heard about the TV set. So it's pretty important, isn't it, that we encourage use of technology in the right places, and that those in a position to influence, use that in an appropriate way.
Yeah, you're right. I think they saw it as a tool they could use to help spread the message, and Charles has already been signed. You see where he's done accepting his, I don't know, I can't remember what it was called, but accepting it was the first time that had ever been televised as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, they're pushing it, and the lunar landing was huge in the US. I remember for most people watching anything at one moment in time. So yeah, it goes both ways, I guess. There's good and bad for those things. If it's the wrong person pushing the technology, then that also usually leads to a big uptake. And all publicity is good publicity, right? So yeah, good to see her, Queen. I think she's been acknowledged as very diligent and very dedicated to her cause. So it's good to see that she was quite innovative and open-minded. When you think of those institutions, you always think they're quite backwards.
Yeah.
So it's cool to see that she was quite progressive in that instance. I think Charles is too, with the environment and things he talks about. So
yeah,
good to see.
Yep. Yeah, look, I think it's going to be an interesting time ahead. Some of the other standouts, we should do her Christmas message, 1957, sort of a live broadcast on TV, and in 1976, sending an email for the first. Her first email, I suppose. It's what I read. It sounded like it was all pre-composed for her and so on. But that was pretty early on. There wouldn't have been too many people able to
send
in a position
emails.
to send emails. So that was very much in in the early days there. And yeah, the list goes on. I guess most recently we've seen the Royals using Zoom and video conferencing, during the pandemic. So it's sort of continued right through, very much, right throughout her life, isn't it?
Yeah, and they've obviously well versed in those technologies to script them in a way. I know their website was immediately updated, straight after the family had been informed of the death and all that sort of stuff, quite scripted in the way they managed the process.
Yeah.
So they must have always done that, you would assume, the radio and the TV and the likes. But yeah, they the big thing in the UK is getting the symbol, the symbol on your product. So I always remember, even in technology products, that was always quite prestigious. I think it was DAB radio that they used to listen to. That gave that a good kick in terms of sales as well.
Right, okay. Is that getting the royal symbol on
with
there?
a royal symbol on something is a big deal.
Yeah.
So even to this day, it's still a big deal. So yeah, hopefully it keeps going on. It's a nice British tradition. It's a good thing for them to have.
Yeah, what can you share from your sort of recollections in the UK?
Yeah, as I mentioned before, I know Prince Philip used to have a technology briefing every year, and we were showing him plasma TV at the time, which he thought was fantastic. So he'd requested technology briefing, and not so much the Queen, I don't think, but definitely Prince Philip. So he was very interested in what was happening in terms of technology evolution. I think he used to visit places like Selfridges and Harrods that always had technology areas as well to see what was new and what was exciting. So it's nice that they keep up with those things. As I said before, you do think they're a bit sort of staid, I guess, in their ways, but obviously not.
Yeah. Oh, really, really encouraging, and there's a whole lot more I'm sure folks that are interested can sort of dive into, and we have a whole new period ahead. So very, very curious how that plays out. But
Do you think Charles might start tweeting?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, they converged the accounts into this royal family account. I think it was, and the Queen's first tweet was 2014. I read. So and um, I think the announcement of of Queen Elizabeth's death was probably first onto Twitter through that royal family account.
Right.
So yeah, so I guess whether King Charles, as we now know him, will be tweeting himself. I'm not probably picking that would be
No.
his thing, but that's something that gets delegated and goes through some sort of process before it comes out of Twitter.
Filter,
Yeah,
I'm sure.
yeah. Now, of course, the other big thing in the last few days, Apple's announcements that we kind of get used to happening at this time of year, and there are a few things that jumped out at me. There's this new dynamic island, which I thought very sort of typical of Apple to be able to brand this thing, which is sort of there's a negative to the fact that you've got part of your screen has to be blacked out for your cameras and so on. But the way they've actually managed to turn that into a feature, I thought quite impressive. But one thing it did immediately sort of highlight for me is this difference now between their Pro iPhones and the normal iPhones of each generation, because this feature is only going to the Pro devices. And then the other thing that they've done is they've not actually brought through the new generation of chip or processor into the standard iPhone. So you're buying an iPhone 14, this year, newly announced phone, all very exciting, but actually you're getting last year's product to a large extent. Yes, there's some improvements, but I thought that's a bit of a shock. And to me, it does feel like a very smart move from a business perspective in terms of how do you get more margin and more profit. And of course, we have been in a period of inflation, so prices have been moving up in lots of things. Generally, not so much with technology, and maybe there's a pressure there in terms of pleasing those that hold Apple stock. But to me, it seemed like a reasonably sort of negative thing to the consumer, to change that. And maybe they've been thinking about it for years, and they decided this was the time to do it. But of course, being an older chip, you get a shorter lifespan for the product as well in terms of likely product updates and so on.
A lot of memes I saw of people showing the same thing again. Did you see some of those?
Yeah,
Like a guy getting a shirt out and he was already wearing the shirt. So, but hey, inflation is a real problem for everyone, and you've got to make sure you can maintain a price point. I think you're right on the dynamic
island. Yeah,
island. I think that is clever, very clever.
As
you say, turning a negative into a positive and a feature. That's quite cool. It's very Apple-esque.
Yeah, and look, we were talking last week around how Apple have passed the 50% sort of threshold in terms of market share in the US market. They're coming from a strong base, and there's never a perfect time, to have to make adjustments if you've decided that you need to as a business that's going to maybe leave customers feeling not quite as pleased with what you've done. But we do see these things happen, and we'll be curious to see whether there's much of a hit in terms of those iPhone sales this year, or whether Apple kind of get what they would hope for, which is maybe a few more people stepping up to the Pro product.
Yeah, exactly right.
It's going to be interesting to see it play out. I see there's been a bit of coverage around the price hasn't gone up, etc., etc. Of course, reality is that US dollar has increased in value against most currencies. So, of course, actually, here in New Zealand, we've seen quite a reasonably, steep increase in the price, prices across the board, of the new products. And Apple does tend to keep their price the same generally throughout the life of a product, unless it has a very, very long life. So that's something that will impact a few folks.
Think of the investment you're putting into if you got the watch and the phone versus the price of a very high-end computer not too long ago. It's about the same money. So
yeah. I think that the plus side now is that phones, to a degree, I think that people can keep them longer. They've got a longer sort of useful life in a lot of cases. It does vary. It depends what your use cases are.
And you're using it for everything, so you can warrant the expense.
Yeah, well, it gets a lot. They get a lot of use. Now onto what's happening here in New Zealand, Todd. Very keen to hear about what's been going on with Samsung Networks and what you've been doing with Spark, because that's really where you're working, isn't it? Because we've got our 3 networks across New Zealand at this point. All 3 are using Nokia networks, but in Spark's case, they're also working with Samsung, which was pretty big news when it was announced. So kind of keen to understand a little bit of how that's working, and what have been the interesting sort of learnings, because your focus with Spark is on the sort of metropolitan Auckland area. Is that right?
Yeah, Spark are using our sort of higher capacity product in places like Auckland, so it can carry a lot more traffic. So that's what our product is suited to. That was sort of our point of difference, very much so at the start when we started this journey in 2019.
Yep.
A very slim and tall massive MIMO unit, which gives you multiple traffic in both directions, like a motorway for 5G technology.
So a lot of lanes for lots of communication and,
a lot of lanes
fast communications, right? Yep.
And so we've used that here in Auckland. When we last talked, we just done it in Christchurch. COVID lockdowns and things slowed down the progress collectively, but now we're really ramping up with Spark, and we should have much stronger 5G penetration. It's interesting you talk about iPhone. We're already seeing on the handset side now, about 70% of the market value is 5G enabled handsets, and the traffic we're seeing already is quite high for a very limited 5G footprint. So people are using it. If they know they're using it or not, that's the other question, because your phone will just click straight over to it. But you're getting 10 times the sort of standard LTE speeds or 4G speeds. So people should notice the difference.
Yeah, I guess it comes down to what you're doing. So that that extra capacity, why is that important in an environment like Auckland?
Yeah, well, the faster you have traffic delivered, the faster you're off the network as well, so the next person can jump on it. So it means you get a lot less cell congestion on the sites, and because you can carry more traffic, you can have products like fixed wireless broadband over 5G. Traditionally, if you had the Netflix effect of people all turning on their TV at the same time to stream, and they're all using fixed wireless, you may have some capacity challenges, but that diminishes with 5G. Also with 5G, the 4G is being upgraded at the same time. So an interesting thing we were talking about last week was, a lot of these programs Spark have called Skinny Jump, which is a broadband product for people who can't afford broadband.
Yep.
And so with 5G now, they can move the normal traffic from 4G to 5G and free up more of that 4G space for these people to use these sorts of programs, which is nice too. Right.
And this is giving those who maybe haven't traditionally afforded internet access, say, a product at a lower cost that gives them that access.
Yeah, they give it for free up to a certain capacity so you can do your homework and everything after school.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. That's awesome. And looking at how things operate in New Zealand, and the differences between, say, here, we were talking about Japan before we started. What are some of those sort of uniques in terms of underlying infrastructure and other parts that kind of make a difference to the way these things fit together?
The big thing is the fiber backbone and the fiber network through the country. So we've had different governments upgrade over the years, probably to the point where they think the job's done, but there's still a lot of work to do if you're talking about delivering to a cell site. So that could be in the middle of absolutely nowhere. Other countries do have a much more sophisticated fiber backbone, places like Japan, Korea, even their cell site coverage. New Zealand, we have around about 5,500 cell sites. South Korea has, I think it's 750,000 cell sites, and it's not the same geographic size as New Zealand. So we tend to measure our coverage by population, whereas not by geography. So there's a lot of places where you can't actually get any coverage, and very difficult to deliver fiber and power to those sites. You talked about satellite connectivity. So if we did have a much stronger fiber backbone, then we could have emergency services and things on cellular networks, which we don't have today.
So do you think that's something that's reasonably achievable in New Zealand, sort of noting our geography and population and so on? It's just another area, I guess, of investment, right? And that's the challenge, isn't it?
Yeah, it's going to have a tipping point
where the money needs to get spent.
Either you prioritize that over something else, or you get it to a point where that whole sort of central trunk of the country is totally covered, which it pretty much is today. But yeah, it's an interesting one because it's huge money. You think to dig up the ground, lay down cables, huge money. And maybe a technology will come that can circumnavigate that. But yeah, I think it's more so from a regulatory perspective, we need to look at things like spectrum to make sure that that's secure for the different technologies.
Right.
As a starting position.
Yep. Now, for Spark, who are working with Samsung and Nokia, and then we've got Vodafone and 2 Degrees who are just working with Nokia at this stage. 2
Degrees Ericsson, actually.
Okay. Yep.
So we're unique. We've got 3 vendors in the smallest country in the world, basically.
Yep. Yeah, it's quite unusual. So how does that compare with other markets that Samsung's working in? Because how long has Samsung, had the network business, and what does that look like elsewhere?
Our network business has really been growing since the 4G era. We did the world's largest 4G only network, Reliance Jio in India, which is Samsung Core, Samsung RAN. So that was a big stimulus for Samsung, but a lot of research in the 5G space. So when that transition came to 5G, we moved quite quickly into it. Before the standards were set, we worked with Verizon on a fixed wireless access project in the US. And now all 3 Korean operators that launched in 2019 are Samsung based product. So that's sort of the bread and butter of it. And then Japan, we work with quite a few of the operators in Japan as well. Back to the Queen, we're back in Vodafone UK in Bath, the ancient royal town.
I've been to Bath.
Yes.
It was the home of the original sort of hot pools or something,
That's
wasn't
right,
it?
Roman hot pools.
Yeah.
So we've done working on an Open RAN program with Vodafone in the UK. And that's where you talk about moving from physical hardware to virtual hardware, so software platforms. And we're quite advanced in that, which is a virtualized environment. So we've also done that here. So you can have a lot more capacity, easier to manage, easier to upgrade, rather than having to physically change something at a cell site.
Right. And so is that the direction that the whole world goes, is to this sort of Open RAN technology?
Depends who you talk to. So I think Dish is the poster boy for it, but Dish is a greenfields network solution. So very easy to say, we're going to go open software-based platform, cloud, etc., when you haven't invested hundreds of millions of dollars already in compute, storage, those sorts of things. So I think the answer will be a hybrid, most likely, because you can't just scrap your existing infrastructure. If you're a new operator, most likely you would. And it's the same sort of concept now when you think about cloud compute. If you're setting something up from scratch, you're probably going to use a Microsoft Azure, Amazon, AWS. You're not going to go buy a whole rack of servers and put them in the bottom of your building. Same sort of analogy, I think, really.
Yep. So so where does sort of Samsung, where does your offering sort of fit on this?
We
I
can do
guess,
both.
yeah.
So yeah, we can do, but we're more in the virtualized space. So our software sits, we can work with what we call off-the-shelf servers. So we tend to work with HP, Dell, those types of traditional computing platforms rather than proprietary equipment.
Yep.
And then our smarts are sitting over the top of it, and our radios. We can also work with someone else's radio and our software, or mix it all up, and vice versa. So we're quite flexible in that aspect. It's generally a bit of a closed door industry because people like to protect it, their business. So being small means we can come in and disrupt a little bit more.
Yep. Now, since the door's sort of, largely been closed to Huawei, how has that, changed the picture in this part of the world?
Oh, it's changed it a lot. So obviously, Spark opened up to look at new vendors, which is where we came from. 2 Degrees as well, had to as well. So it's, as well as that transition of technology, it transitioned the vendors, I think, in that aspect. So it's created a lot of opportunity for other vendors. Huawei is very good and well priced, so it's set the bar high for everybody.
Yeah, and I think probably a shock to those that have that had invested in that direction, right? So it's caused quite a bit of disruption. And so where to from here? Where does your gear sort of sit now in terms of within the Spark network? Are you able to talk about what cities it's in and so on?
Oh, just mainly we're just Christchurch and Auckland at the moment, so
Yeah.
that's our main projects for the next wee while. We'll start to work on some more frequency bands with Spark as they move those to 5G, refarm, etc. We're very interested in millimeter wave. Millimeter wave's a strong technology for Samsung. We've done in the US, so we're very interested in that as well. And looking how we can bring that to New Zealand. That depends on some spectrum also.
Yeah.
So we'll look to millimeter wave. And then we're looking at some of those use cases, how we can help. Private networks is becoming quite big internationally.
Yeah.
Things like the smart factory, etc., which we don't have so much here, but I'm sure there'll be New Zealand use cases that private networks will be useful for too.
Yeah. And where do you see the value of millimeter wave? As you say, it needs a different block of spectrum, and we haven't seen that broadly finalized here. We have certain scenarios where that could be useful. Are there any that?
There's a few different interesting ones. Traditionally, it's seen as high bandwidth, low coverage, so deep in the city,
in park,
places like stadiums, etc.
Scenario.
But now you're seeing more and more rural trials. So there's been a few conducted here and in Australia, up to sort of 10 kilometres of coverage. So that will be more interesting from a rural perspective. We've done an interesting study in the subway in Seoul. So if you think of like 10,000 people all jumping off a subway train at the same time, it's pretty difficult for them to connect. So they've been using millimeter wave as the backhaul for Wi-Fi through the subway trains. So there's lots of different use cases. It's a bit easier to deploy. It doesn't need as many people climbing a tower. Smaller and lightweight. So it probably will be complementary technology to the current technology we're deploying.
Yep. Now, we haven't seen much fixed wireless access and sort of 5G at this point in time. It does seem as though your access point is still quite pricey for those at the moment. Is that do you think that's the main reason that's stops 5G being used for fixed wireless as just sort of the standard option today?
Yeah, well, coverage is a big thing too. So obviously it's not available to a lot of homes. So you can't really market something until it's big enough to tell everybody about it. But,
True. Yep.
But also, I know the operators are very cautious on how they approach those technologies because they don't want someone getting a modem delivered to their house and going, it doesn't work. There's no coverage in my house. So they keep the coverage maps quite tight until they're sure you actually do have it. So those are probably the limiting factors at the moment.
All right. So, we just need to wait for that to keep expanding, which, of course, does take a bit of time.
Yeah, and it's going a lot quicker now too. So we're seeing a lot of sites come on each week. So once everyone's sort of in the rhythm, it starts to become a lot faster.
So you're at how many sites in Auckland, and what would you sort of expect to get to?
Oh, that Sparks world that we can't talk about. But we think we've got about 1 million people covered already in Auckland. Around about 20 odd suburbs are covered already.
Yep.
Mainly from the Harbour Bridge south, and then we're coming over the Harbour Bridge going north next year.
Oh, that's pretty good. Excellent. Oh, it's been great. Great to catch up, Todd, and thanks for your insights and contributing to the NZ Tech podcast today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah,
appreciate it.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Well, thanks everyone for listening in, and we'll be back again next week. Of course, a thank you to our show partners, Vodafone, 2 Degrees, Spark, HP, Gorilla Technology, and Deal. So, if you are listening to the live stream, it's well worth getting hold of the audio show, which you can subscribe to through any podcast app, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts. If you are listening to the audio show and you haven't caught the video, you might quite like to get the earliest access to NZ Tech Podcast. And the best way to do that at the moment is probably by following me on LinkedIn, but you can also find us across Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. So look out for NZ Tech Podcast on each of those channels. That's it from us. We'll catch you again next week. Cheers.
The New Zealand Tech Podcast, brought to you by Gorilla Technology, proactive and strategic IT.